The Old Testament reading today is from 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 15. Elijah ascends to heaven. Now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he said, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. The company of prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he answered, "Yes, I know. Be silent." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went, and stood at some distance from them, as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elisha took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water. The water was parted to the one side and to the other, until the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha said, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. Elisha succeeds Elijah. He picked up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water, saying, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" When he had struck the water was parted to the one side and to the other, and Elisha went over. When the company of prophets who were at Jericho saw him at a distance, they declared, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." They came to meet him and bowed to the ground before him.
Let us pray. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Well, one day you go to the mailbox and you find an envelope, and you notice on the return address it says, Brown, Smith, and Jones, attorneys at law. And you open it and you think, oh, I wonder what this is. But it's good news. What kind of good news? Your aunt has died. Not good news, but she decided to leave her estate to you. You say, oh, that's really good. You know, we were really close and became great friends, and it won't amount to much, but it was a great gesture. Well, a few weeks later, you get another envelope from the same law firm, and they say, we've done the accounting on all of your aunt's assets, and your part of the inheritance will be $3 million. What would you do with this windfall that you did nothing for? But what an inheritance. And would you go out and buy everything you ever wanted, and probably some things you'd never even thought about before? Or maybe you'd be a little more prudent and put it all in the bank and say, I'm going to live off it the rest of my life. Or maybe you'd say, I was doing just great without that $3 million, and I think I'm going to give away most of it to people who really need the money. Oh, we have all sorts of choices with what gifts we receive. But what do we do with the gifts we receive? That's the question. And we receive gifts all the time. Inheritances are just special because it's obviously a gift. It's something we didn't work for. It's something we can't even show gratitude to the person for because they're gone. The only gratitude we could ever show is the gratitude we showed to them before they died. It's a gift. An inheritance. Well, this story about Elijah and Elisha is about inheritance. It's about what happens when somebody leaves the earth to what their message was, what their life was about. And in this case, we find that somehow everybody knows it's Elijah's time. He goes to Gilgal, and he goes to Bethel, and then they go to the Jordan, and in Bethel, we're told 50 of the sons of the prophets follow them. Now, Elijah's really the leader of the sons of the prophets, no matter where they are, because of his recent ability to bring fire down upon an altar that he doused with water when the 400 priests of Baal couldn't do anything. He was accepted as their leader. And so they get to the Jordan. And each time they stop, Elijah says, you followed me long enough. You just stay here. And each time they stop, all the prophets tell Elisha, your master's going to leave today. But Elisha doesn't leave. He stays with Elijah all the way through. When they cross the Jordan, and the 50 prophets are probably back up on a hill watching, they're amazed because Elijah simply, without much fanfare, takes his mantle, the robe around him, rolls it up and strikes the water, reminding them of Moses, of course, or Joshua. And of course, the waters part. And Elijah and Elisha walk over to the other side of the Jordan on dry ground. Now they are standing approximately in the same area where Moses died. The place where Moses died now is the place where Elijah will be taken up to heaven. Now, we know the story about the chariots and the fire and all of that, but we get it mistaken because it's a very complex image. But it's made simplified by a lot of the artwork that we've seen throughout the ages that's come down to us, where it shows kind of Elijah riding the chariot with the horses in front of him. Obviously, the artist didn't read the text very well. The chariot and the horses come between Elisha and Elijah. Elijah is carried up in a whirlwind of fire, disappearing. But before this happens, Elisha makes a request. He has been faithful to the very end. And he says, may I have a double portion of your spirit? And Elijah says, that's a very hard thing to ask. But if you see me until I'm gone, you shall have it. Well, Elisha does see him until he's gone. And when he sees him go, it's heartrending. I mean, Elisha has been his disciple for a long time. He hates to see Elijah go. He rends his clothes, indicating great sorrow. But then he picks up the mantle that Elijah has left. Because a double portion doesn't mean he's going to have double the power that Elijah has. People misinterpret that all the time. It's simply part of the inheritance that used to be in this time period. You see, the first son was the rightful successor to the father. And therefore, the first son got 2 shares of the inheritance, where everyone else got 1 share. And that's what Elisha was asking. Can I be your successor? Can I be your heir? And the answer is obviously yes. Because now Elisha takes the mantle, wraps it up, touches the Jordan, which parts again, and walks back into Israel, just as Joshua had done when the Ark of the Covenant crossed over the Jordan, which had been parted and was on dry land. You know, the story about this inheritance reminds us about our inheritances. What have we received in life? You know, most people, when we think about inheritance, think about what I started out with, you know, the money and property and all that comes to somebody when another person dies. Well, there's how we deal with whatever inheritance we receive. Physical, material, whatever. Spiritual. How we react to that inheritance is a lot more important than what that inheritance was. There's a story about a relative of Andrew Carnegie. He didn't have any children, but a relative received $1 million from him in his estate. And shortly after he died, this relative started complaining in public to others, saying, you know, he only left me a measly $1 million when he gave $365 million to different charities out of his estate. Only a measly $1 million. Now, those charities he gave to have affected all of us, probably. I know they've affected me because the first libraries that I ever went in and checked out a book from that weren't school libraries were Carnegie libraries. What a legacy to leave. And yet, this relative knew that he could have gotten so much more, so he wasn't happy with the $1 million, and yet $1 million at that time, even if he just put it in the bank and drew interest, would have put him in the top 10% of the income in the United States. He could have lived a wealthy person the rest of his life. But instead, he complained that he didn't get more. Of course, generosity from somebody who's died, the cynical would say, well, it's not really generosity because you can't take it with you, right? You can't take it with you, so you might as well give it away. Well, there's a story about that, and a miser who wanted to prove he could take it with him. So one day, he, close to death, called in his doctor and his minister and his lawyer. Good people to talk to when you're about to die. And he said, I want to prove I can take it with me, and I've got 3 envelopes here. And at my funeral, before they close the coffin, I want you to throw in these envelopes in with me. Each envelope contains $30,000. I'm going to take it with me. So the day came, and the 3 of them all obligatorily threw in the envelopes. But at the reception, they got to talking, and the minister finally said, you know, I have a confession to make. I thought, why waste $30,000? So I took $10,000 and gave it to a missions project and threw in $20,000. And the doctor says, I'm glad you said that because, you know, the new hospital wing needs to be built, and so I took 20,000 of it and gave it to the hospital and threw in 10,000. And the lawyer looked at them aghast and said, I can't believe you didn't follow his instructions. I threw in the whole 30,000 in the form of a personal check. You know, what do we do with our inheritances? What do we do with that which has been given to us and yet we have nothing to do with? People who have received much less in material goods than Carnegie's relatives have allowed their inheritances to change their lives, given them the space to make for better times. And yet not all inheritances are good, are they? If you've received during your life in the family abuse and violence, that's likely what you will visit on your children. We inherit many things. It's not just money. You know, we inherit physical traits. You know, I look the way I am because of my mom and dad. We inherit material things. We inherit intellectual stuff. We inherit spiritual stuff. You know, a little boy comes home, he's got a problem because he has a report card. And he's trying to figure out whether it's inheritance or it's learned behavior. Well, the report card has 5 F's on it. And so he goes to his dad and he says, what do you think, Dad? Is it heredity or environment? What's the dad going to say? You know, I've talked about physical and material inheritances because they're easier to see. But you know, what I really want to talk about is our spiritual inheritance. What have we received? We've received much, most of which was a gift. How did we receive those gifts? Because as I said earlier, how we respond to the gifts is more important than the gifts themselves. Now, we respond to our spiritual inheritance, an inheritance that is from the church. Now, let me explain. I hear lots of people talking about being spiritual, even following Jesus. But, you know, I don't want to deal with this church, which is flawed because it's human. But you know what? Without that church, you wouldn't know about Jesus. Without the inheritance that comes through the church, where would our spirituality be? Would we even have any? Would we think about how our lives have been changed because of what we've been given? Now, it could be a multitude of things, but I'm just going to go through a few inheritances that we have received through the church. I'm talking about the church universal, not just any specific church. But, to give you an idea, we wouldn't have known about Jesus. And you know, Jesus wouldn't have been the person he was if he hadn't had inheritances from his Hebrew tradition. But our tradition includes a Bible, decisions about the early church, which we're going to be talking about in our Bible study in the next few weeks, the long tradition of church history, our individual local church, and individuals who have affected us because of our faith. Let's go through them one at a time. The Bible, that is an amazing inheritance. Yeah, it's a book. But it's a book unlike most others. It's a book of many, many stories of how people encountered God and how they reacted to God. And how that changed their relationships with one another. Man, what a resource. What a gift to help us understand how is it that we respond when we encounter God. Either through a cataclysmic event or in that still small voice. How do we respond? Well, the Bible is one of our inheritances, but it's not the only one. Immediately after the Bible was written, we had to decide what the Christian church would be. Was it going to be just another branch of Judaism? Was it going to be open to the Gentiles? And what did we believe about this Jesus guy? That got decided in the next 200-300 years. An important inheritance for us. Maybe codified most in the Apostles' Creed, but in many other ways too. Throughout the centuries, we also have received much. I mean, where would Luther have been if it hadn't been for the inheritance he received from Augustine? And where would we be without Luther's insights? And how would we be able to appreciate the creation and nature as much as we do if there hadn't been Francis of Assisi? And although philosophers always like to argue, I don't think any of them can argue that Thomas Aquinas changed the thinking forever in Western civilization. Just a few of the major contributors to a long tradition of inheritance. But that's not quite as personal as the inheritance you have here at Aspen Community Church. You're here because certain people, probably part of this church, have affected your lives. Maybe they now passed on. Or maybe they've moved, as so many people in Aspen do, constantly moved somewhere else. And you don't have quite the connection. But you're here. And you've received much because of others who have taken part in this congregation. And even on a less formal way, think about all of those people who have affected your lives, be they in this congregation or other congregations before. You know, as most of you know, I grew up Roman Catholic. And the heritage that I received from that was amazing. In a shorthand way of saying it. When I went to seminary, I found out that many of my fellow students actually could quote more of the Bible. But my teaching helped me be more theological about it. Ask, what does it mean? It was a great inheritance I received. And then in high school, on a more individual basis, a United Methodist minister named John Francis, who died last year, I went to his funeral, had a great impact upon what I believe, how I see the world. In seminary, the person was Jim Nelson, one of my professors. You know, I am always amazed at how I am who I am today because of what I've received. As I mentioned, inheritances are always gifts. But we've received so many other gifts and we don't recognize it. We are not alone on our spiritual journeys. We have been faithful to many of God's messengers. And who we follow and who we allow to affect our lives makes all the difference in the world. if we follow those who truly understand the grace of God, what they've been given, and speak with humility, and seek to serve, we will become like them. If we follow other, quote, Christian leaders who have judged everyone and everything, and know that they categorically speak for God, we will become like them, with no humility, no grace. We choose, just like Elisha chose, to be a disciple and to follow those who have seen God in certain ways. Who will you follow? And what has been your inheritance? You know, this sermon started, I asked you, how would you handle an inheritance of $3 million? But I am asking how you would handle a much more important inheritance. How will you handle your spiritual inheritance? Will you respond like Carnegie's relative, asking, why didn't I get more? That person can be much more Christian than I can. They can pray better than I can. They do things that I wish I could do. Or are we thankful? And in that thanksgiving, knowing that our inheritance is enough to allow us to live a life of grace, to live a life knowing God's love for us and sharing that love with others. Of course, when we ask, what have we received from an inheritance, there is another question, isn't there? What will we leave? What will our legacy be? What spiritual inheritance will you pass on? I'd like you to think about that today. What will your spiritual inheritance to others be? Because, you know, when we genuinely accept our spiritual inheritance, two things happen. And they can be expressed in one word: thanksgiving. We become filled with gratitude and thanks for what we've received. And we seek to be able to give so that others might also experience with great gratitude the love and the grace of God. May your lives be filled with thanksgiving. Amen.